Hi, this is Pod Save the UK. I'm Nish Kumar.
And I'm Coco Khan. Today, Trump's foreign policy shift has left Europe reeling. But is Starmer's vision of sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine the answer?
I don't know about you, Coco, but I would say troops on the ground in Ukraine doesn't sound particularly peaceful to me.
No, I know. I'm hearing a lot of the word frontline on the radio today, which doesn't make me feel great. And also, immediately after you hear these words, frontline, you hear this tidbit from a former military chief who basically says we don't have enough money, we don't have enough resources in the army to actually run a frontline.
All of it's adding up to me holding a gun, which no one wants.
No, that does not make me feel secure on a national level, Nish.
Also, I don't look great in green.
But elsewhere, a petition to ban children under the age of 16 from social media is doing the rounds. Tortoise Tech reporter Patricia Clark is here to tell us whether this will really save the children.
And we'll be joined by author and journalist Shon Faye to understand why so many of us feel unlucky in love and to ask who's profiting.
Now, this week has seen a monumental meeting between Russia and the United States to discuss the future of Ukraine. It was held in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, blindsiding leaders in Ukraine and Europe who were cut out of the negotiations.
And earlier in the week, Donald Trump suggested European security can no longer be the primary focus of the American military, and in doing so, plunged the future of the transatlantic relationship into question and undermined an 80-year-long military alliance. European leaders hastily convened a meeting to discuss their response. Here's Prime Minister Keir Starmer speaking after the meeting.
I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
So Starmer's suggestion of a US backstop to deter Russia wasn't quite explained there, but we might find out next week when Starmer meets with Trump in Washington.
However, some European leaders weren't quite ready to make the same commitments for boots on the ground, with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying it's inappropriate to discuss sending troops in at this stage and that he was a little irritated by the suggestion. Following the meeting between Russia and Ukraine, Trump's given a press conference where he seems to have blamed Ukraine for the war, saying, "You never should have started it." And if anybody needs a reminder, just to be clear, Ukraine did not choose to invade itself. He also said that they'd had 3 years to end the war, and this, just a half-baked negotiator, could have settled this years ago without the loss of much land, very little land, without the loss of any lives, and without the loss of cities that are just laying on their sides. And he's also demanded an election in Ukraine before any peace deal can be reached, which would naturally be a sort of prime target for Russian interference. One of the potential objectives that various experts in the region have always stated was at the heart of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is to essentially replace Zelenskyy and install a kind of pro-Putin puppet. In effect, bringing Ukraine under Russian control, a little bit like what Lukashenko's done in Belarus. Obviously, we will be discussing this through the frame of British politics. And the challenge here is that next week, Keir Starmer is going to have a meeting with Donald Trump. And Starmer is trying to position the United Kingdom as essentially a conduit between Trump's America and the European Union. And what I would say is that it's about time that people wake up and smell the dog shit, because there's this idea that the US and Europe are mutually aligned in their values, but that does not hold water under the Trump presidency, okay? There is a reason that they had peace talks and did not invite Ukraine. I have no idea how we steer a course through this, but the very fact that the peace talks happened with Russia and they happened in Saudi Arabia should be a clue to where Trump sees American alignment. America is no longer aligning itself with Europe. It is aligned with these kind of despotic, ethno-nationalist states. He has much more in common in terms of his outlook on domestic and foreign policy with Mohammed bin Salman, with Vladimir Putin, and with Benjamin Netanyahu, okay?
He loves the idea that superpowers can just do whatever they want. And the superpowers are America, China, Russia, Saudi, I guess, because they've got loads of money. Europe is not a superpower in his mind.
Yeah.
And so that really tells you his bully boy mentality, that there's a natural order to might is right and bigger gets whatever they want, right?
Yeah.
And so where does that leave Britain? Well, we've sort of ruined many alliances after Brexit. Okay, so maybe we align ourselves more with Europe. I'm not convinced that we can be this conduit. I think we might have to choose a side a bit here. Maybe this is a time for us and Europe to kind of reconcile and work together to face this kind of large looming economic threat.
Yeah, I mean, Starmer needs to look at who Trump is and what he has done.
Yeah.
It feels like he's trying to do a deal with somebody that has no interest in doing a deal with him. And as if to underscore this idea that America is no longer aligned with the UK and Europe, J.D. Vance launched a barrage of criticism towards the continent and our country last week at the Munich Security Conference, suggesting that European values suppress free speech and questioning whether our values are worth defending. Here is a clip from the man who is, let's be clear, the Vice President of America.
If you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you. Nor, for that matter, is there anything that you can do for the American people.
What an absolute joker. This posturing of like European values, censorious, and that they are the true flag bearers of free speech is completely ludicrous. I don't know if you saw Newsnight last night, but there was an ex-Trump advisor arguing with Victoria Derbyshire on there. And she actually said, well, something to the effect of Britain can't talk because you've got more people in jail for expressing your opinion than Russia. You what? What are you talking about? That's just completely made up nonsense. It sounds like at the minute Starmer's coming out pretty strong, maybe even stronger than some European leaders. Do you think at the minute this is good? This is like a good moment for Starmer to be doing this? Is he showing leadership? Is this going to work well for him?
I think this is an incredibly precarious moment for him because he's really stressing this idea, our whole government's domestic growth agenda is tied up in our trading relationships with the United States. And I think it's an unenviable position to find yourself in, to have snookered yourself effectively to having to deal with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I will say that domestically, in terms of this phrase about boots on the ground, if it were to be put to a parliamentary vote, I don't suspect domestically he would face a huge amount of opposition to that. I think there would be political pressure on him to not do that. But I think given that the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has already backed Starmer's plans, I'm not sure that there would be a huge amount of opposition internally to it.
I think there might be some from the public, though, because, there's just a top line piece in Bloomberg that was saying that, they worked it out and the cuts to public services to fund defence would be up to 11%.
Yeah.
11%. I mean, that is a lot. And there will be sections of the general public that are like, I'm sorry, why are we cutting our services for a war that's really far away in a completely different, where are your priorities, Starmer? And I think part of me thinks, this is, he's really showing his leadership a bit here and maybe this is going to be good for him. Another part of me thinks this is terrible for him. Morality is clearly no longer a factor in any of this. And you kind of see the narratives changing, even like, some of the comments that Trump's made being, protecting Europe's no longer our main priority, as though all these things were done out of the goodness of America's heart. And actually, when you look at the money that has gone in to support Ukraine, Europe has given more than America collectively, not one individual nation, sure. So, again, cutting them out of the talks is this really horrific thing to do, an unfair thing to do. But you can just get this sense of like the wheels turning, the narrative turning. And part of me is like, this is the new allegiance. It's Trump and Putin and, whatever, other dictators, despots, or whatever we want to call them. But then I also saw a comment that he released earlier where he said it would be fine for any European countries to continue to buy arms from America if they do want to choose to progress this conflict. And you just think, okay, maybe this isn't about alliance. This is just about money, as it was all along.
I think you're exactly right to point that out, because at the same time as European leaders gathered in Paris to respond to Trump's actions, shares in major arms manufacturers soared. BAE Systems, the UK's largest defence company, saw its stock climb 9% in London. In Paris, Thales jumped 7.8%, while Rheinmetall surged 14% in Frankfurt. The StockX and European Aerospace and Defence Index hit its highest level since the early 1990s. So investors are certainly seeking to capitalise on this period of geopolitical instability. And it therefore follows that from an American perspective, whilst Trump may not have any interest in being part of any peacekeeping in the continent, he's certainly very, very happy, as you point out, to sell us weapons.
So in the end, who are the losers? It's just going to be normal civilians who are caught up in this mess.
Yeah.
And who are the winners? The arms manufacturers, basically.
Look, if you're following the latest on Starmer's Ukraine boots on the ground comment and the European Informal Summit, you won't want to miss this week's Pod Save the World. They're breaking down the start of the US-Russia negotiations, which happened without Ukraine at the table, the Trump-era shift in US foreign policy and what it all means for Europe.
Plus, US President J.D. Vance and Elon Musk meddling in the German election, Austria's far-right flopping, and more.
For the full global picture, check out Pod Save the World. New episodes every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
So, back to the UK, I have a clip to play for you. It's not just Olaf Scholz that has been more than a little irritated with Starmer lately. While out and about at a development in Milton Keynes, the Prime Minister's trip was cut short after an intervention from farmers. They were protesting the government's inheritance tax plans in this clip from The Guardian.
If you couldn't pick out that tune, that was Sandstorm by Darude. And I don't think I ever thought I'd be saying Keir Starmer's name in the same sentence as Darude. To borrow a phrase from the comedian Maria Bamford, I'm actually surprised that Sandstorm is still speaking to people.
Oh, yeah. It's a classic. It's an absolute club classic. I'm genuinely very impressed. I'm just impressed that they did that. Do you think it was a pre-record? No, it couldn't have been.
No, I think they're playing live. I think there's no.
That's just brilliant.
This is not a Milli Vanilli situation.
Get you a farmer that can do both.
Now, look, last week we had our say on the government's latest moves on immigration, including denying citizenship to asylum seekers who arrive outside of legal channels and grossly sharing footage of people being deported. We called it performative cruelty. And it turns out loads of people within the Labour Party agree. A group of over 900 Labour members and trade unions have signed an open letter decrying the government's latest moves, including MPs and former guests on our show, Nadia Whittome, Bel Ribeiro-Addy and Clive Lewis.
The letter said, and we quote, "These measures mimic the performative cruelty of the failed Tory governments rejected by voters last July. They also breach Britain's international obligations to respect the right to claim asylum and guarantee safe routes. Far from being a drain on this country, migrants from all over the world enrich our society in every sense. Anti-migrant politics will not build a single house, staff a single hospital, or raise anyone's wages. Instead, by echoing its rhetoric, the government is simply fueling the rise of Reform UK."
Nice to hear some...
Yeah, it was good. Pulling no punches there either.
Yeah.
No legitimate concerns. You don't see that sort of language in there.
Yeah.
Because Starmer was saying this week, we have to accept that there are legitimate grievances. Every time I read these things, I'm like, the picture that is created is so that everyone's got their fingers in their ears going, la, 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 la. We left the EU. We sabotaged our economy. We took away the sort of opportunities for the young. We've left ourselves in a desert. What do you mean? Why are you acting? We've done it. We did the thing. Why I hate this narrative?
Yeah, and, again, like... I said it last week, I'm sure I've said it about 100 times. There are wealth extractors bleeding our country dry, but they are simply not immigrants and asylum seekers.
Yeah.
It's easier to rhetorically whack the powerless. The more complicated thing to do is to go after the people actively responsible, the wealth extractors, who for the last 15, 20 years have sort of bled this country dry.
Now, after the break, we're asking, what's love got to do with it? We're speaking to Shon Faye. Pod Save the UK is brought to you by Shopify.
That's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform to start, run, and grow your own business.
Shopify is the commerce platform revolutionizing millions of businesses worldwide. Whether you're selling succulents or stilettos, Shopify simplifies selling online and in person so you can successfully grow your business.
Covering all your sales channels from a shop-front-ready POS system to its all-in-one e-commerce platform, Shopify even gets you selling across social media marketplaces like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.
Full of the industry-leading tools ready to ignite your growth, Shopify gives you complete control over your business and your brand without learning new skills in design or coding.
And thanks to award-winning help and with an extensive business course library, Shopify is ready to support your success every step of the way.
What's lovely about Shopify is that no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify will be there to empower you with the confidence and control to take your business to the next level.
It's time to get serious about selling and get Shopify today. This is Possibility, powered by Shopify.
Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/podsavetheuk. It's all lowercase.
Go to shopify.co.uk/podsavetheuk to take your business to the next level today. Shopify.co.uk/podsavetheuk.
Loneliness has been declared a growing epidemic across the world and is now regarded as a global health threat by the World Health Organization. Men are faring the worst. In the UK and US, 1 in 5 single men say they have no close friends. And men make up 61% of users on dating apps, with more and more becoming unintentionally single long term.
In the age of dating apps and social media, we're more connected than ever. So why are so many of us feeling socially isolated or struggling to find love? And what's more, who is profiting from the disconnect? Here to help us understand is Shon Faye, journalist and author of the bestseller, The Transgender Issue, which is a rigorous and precise intervention into Britain's anti-trans backlash. Shon has since spent years dishing out life and love advice via her Vogue column, Dear Shon. And building on this, her new book, Love in Exile, explores the highly politicised terrain of modern love and why it eludes us. Shon, welcome to Pod Save the UK.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So often when we think about love, we think of it outside of politics. You know, we're a politics podcast, so why are we having a conversation about love? And I guess I wanted to ask you, why do you think love is a political issue?
I mean, I think it is a political issue. If you think about how often even just politicians mention the word families, right? Like there's an implicit judgment about the way that we lead our lives and what's politically significant. If you think about our laws and our tax system, the fact that if you are not a citizen of the UK, there are certain kind of relationships that means that someone could join you here, and there are certain kinds of relationships where someone can't. And I think a lot of us 5 years ago, it feels like a long time ago now, like in the pandemic, even realized that when we were making kind of these emergency laws around the risk of coronavirus, again, there was a lot of assumptions made about how people conduct their private lives. And also, I mean, like I'm a member of the LGBT community, right? Like, so I'm also, to me, I'm acutely aware that for some people, their love lives have been highly politicized, criminalized by the state, denied the opportunities for legal equality compared to other people. So when we don't normally think, I think, of our love lives, particularly our romantic love lives, as political. We think of them almost as a refuge, like, this is my private life. You close the door and, you know, the political world shut out. But I just don't think that's true.
You argued that under capitalism, love is also privatized. There are private companies influencing our sort of love lives and romantic lives, right? Maybe now more so than ever because of things like dating apps. About 4.4 million people in the UK use them, and about a quarter of the users pay for those services, generating around 150 million quid in annual revenue for the companies behind them. I understand that these companies exist as private companies, they make a profit, but there is something almost like Mr. Burnsy about turning a profit from people trying to find a partner.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it goes beyond even dating apps, which are obviously the most visible, like a spearhead of that. But like I would go so far as to say that a lot of consumerism, the message that's attached is you will become more lovable, or at the very least more desirable. So for women, it's kind of obvious. It might be the cosmetics industry, various other things, beauty, fashion. But for men too, and I think increasingly for men and younger men, there's a whole kind of influencer infrastructure, you know, some of it quite misogynist, some of it less so, about, you know, go to the gym. This is how you lead a life. This is how you access sex. This is how you access desirability. And a lot of this is designed to sell people stuff and to make money. And it's selling people the idea of you will access this thing called love.
I love the book and I thought it was so beautifully written. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about it specifically was the idea that male loneliness is a huge driver in massive societal problems. And, you know, part of that is the way that capitalism has kind of taken a cleaver to lots of organizations like unions and community centers and social clubs that would have normally been places for men to socialize. And in that void, the kind of manosphere has sort of stepped into it. And that has massive political ramifications for all of us, right? Like, it's a really interesting thing to talk about because the manosphere now is like a massive political problem for us. It's a driver behind Trump's election in the States. It's not really something people want to talk about male loneliness and the political consequences of it.
Yeah, and I think it's a difficult conversation to have because like you can look at it with different lenses, right? And I think it can be quite antagonistic to look at it sometimes from a feminist lens because quite rightly a lot of women will be like, well, I've been lonely and I don't become this like raving misogynist. And like it's a valid point, right?
And also sometimes it can feel like implicit in that is that therefore women should pair up with these men. Like that's what you must do to make, you know, I don't want to.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's so true. And almost, that like women are almost like a patriarchal spoil.
Yeah.
Like, oh, they're not getting the partnership they want. I tend to think the differences between men and women in a binary are not due to, there are some aspects of biology, but like a lot of the behavioral stuff is about the social experience. And I think like we're not so different. But one of the things that I always think about masculinity and being raised male, being like raised as a boy, is like how much pressure there is to cut off parts of yourself like that are vulnerable. And I think that really inhibits because the answer isn't just that men are lonely because they're not having enough girlfriends or sexual opportunities. It's also that like a lot of male friendships are undernourishing or non-existent. I mean, I have this particular experience, right? Like I went to an all-boys school, which was pretty traumatic, to be honest. But one of the things that I kind of remember so much about like being like 13 or 14 in this like very crucible of like sort of emergent masculinity is you're only really allowed to like take the piss out of each other. You're only allowed to like, that's how friendship is expressed. There isn't much space for a lot of boys and men to be like vulnerable and to actually talk about their internal worlds with each other. And then when you combine that with this idea that status and power and domination and sex are the ways that you show you're a man, I think you have a real recipe. So like the trouble is I think the heart of the problem is how we raise children to be boys and men, because I think we societally can do a lot of damage.
I'll just come back to this point about the business and the capitalism of love. There's something about this particular moment, and I don't know if I'm right about this, where like it's not in commercial interest for people to actually find love. Like it's better for them to remain lonely, to feel that it's their fault so that they buy more cosmetics or they do, have more whatever juices. And for the app's point of view, the more users, the better, right? So despite the famous slogan of Hinge designed to be deleted, that's not necessarily the case. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, like certainly the business model, right? Like it isn't designed to be deleted. And in fact, there is also a gamification. Like, I'm on dating apps at the moment and it is like, I've just written this book and then I'm sat there being like, maybe if I pay for the upgrade, I'll be able to go through and I'll get a better crop of men.
Yeah.
because I'll be able to see who's like me and then I can fit, because the more you pay, the more filters you get. Because I'm like, well, if I pay an extra £4 a month, I can filter men that only want a relationship, not ones that just want casual sex.
Right.
So there is a gamification where it's like, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, literally. Sure, it's built in, and I wouldn't deny that. I do think I have to sort of factor in here, though, that also we've experienced huge societal change around relationships. And while dating apps, certainly like there is a commercial incentive to keep people lonely, I also think it's broader than that. I think it's the fact that, our working lives, the cost of living, the precarity of the way that we like work and the jobs market and the instability of even like housing. I think about London, where we all are. For young people, I mean, is it actually forces these extreme choices where I either know people that are living with a partner after knowing them 2 months because you can't afford to not. Or, there's also the kind of anxieties that come with you don't have this like roadmap of like, then I'm going to be stable in my job by the time I get to my late 20s and I'll be able to buy a house or whatever. And so people are potentially in a permanent state of adolescence to a certain degree by the economy. That's one other factor on top of all the tech that we use around dating. The other is, I think, is this changing expectations of women around partnership. Like you touched on it earlier where you were like, well, I don't think we should have to date these men. And I think that that's the point, right? Is that like my grandmother, once you got married, that was it. Good or bad, you stuck with it. Like, and if you marry, my mum said this, if you married a wrong un, it would be like, that would be it till someone dies.
Yeah.
And then like, for my mother's generation, my mum was a single mum and divorced my dad in the 90s. And there's a peak of divorce in the UK from the 70s to the 90s. And now divorce rates have actually fallen, but that's because less people get married.
Yeah.
And now I think what we're left with, perhaps for millennials and Gen Z, particularly for, in heteronormative dynamics with women, is women, for a long time now have not needed financial dependence on a man. And there isn't the same level of social pressure on you need to be married in this established kind of partnership.
I mean, this conversation is also tied to the declining birth rate conversation. Do you think it's the government's role to get involved with this?
We're going full socialist now. Like the wealth inequality in the UK is like so egregious, and it's only getting worse. And I think one of the reasons for a falling birth rate is the fact that like younger people cannot see how it's financially viable to have children. Yeah. And until that changes, you're not going to change that. There's also the fact that we're not doing, like, even the stuff like we're not doing anything about the climate. Like, I'm not saying that that governs everyone's decision or not, but there is a general sense of nihilism, political nihilism that has been relentless. Like, if you people like 10 years younger than me, like Gen Z or whatever, like, all they've known is austerity and nothing getting better ever, and no input into the kind of social safety net. I was a child of a single mother in the 90s, which basically, like, it's so funny now because there's a panic around the falling birth rate, but like, single mothers in the 90s, it was basically like, it was their fault and that we should be penalising them. And that, like, these irresponsible women or feckless fathers.
There's been a few things recently that have reviewed the kind of tenor of cultural conversation, whether it was about gender, race or class in the kind of late 90s and early 2000s, that have given me it's like an acid reflux. Like, it's this horrible memory sort of lurching up in my body. Single mums was almost like, culturally, it was almost like a slur that people would throw around.
Yeah, totally. The other thing to say as well is that we haven't like remotely addressed, with all whatever feminist progress there has been, things like domestic violence, which is actually so endemic. And I think like all of us often forget because it's so normalized about how prevalent it is. There has been very little redress of that. And in fact, it's, again, refuge places, support services around domestic violence and family trauma, and social services. I'm from a family of social workers. And I can tell you, like, child protection, like, when the family unit goes wrong, there is nothing. There's so little, like, they're just firefighting all the time. So for me, we would need to improve people's basic income, have like a properly furnished social network, not create socially stigmatizing narratives about alternative family units, whether that's LGBT people, single mothers, whatever, trans people. And then alongside that, also like provide like actual support for when, love isn't there in people's families, and when the society we live in, I say in the book, it's a profoundly sick and loveless society. It's kind of an obvious point, but like hatred is increasingly just very, very validated, and like hatred and anger gets you ahead. We're increasingly losing a space for the idea of compassion. You're made a laughing stock of for even talking about that as a serious political principle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in the book, you devote a chapter to motherhood, and you write, as a society, we profess our love to mothers, but it's clear that we often despise them. Just thinking about what you were saying about like how much hatred there is. I mean, I also grew up single mum. If anyone's seen my father, please direct him to Child Support Agency. I don't know how long those claims.
Same.
Please, there's 36 years of money I'm owed, so please find me.
Yeah, same.
And I think you're right. Like, the villainization of single mums is testimony to this. These are meant to be the mothers that we supposedly love. Right-wing groups are obsessed with the mother, and they use it to be a weapon of oppression.
Yeah.
What did you observe in your book around that?
In the book, I look at like being a trans woman, right? Like for most of the 2010s, one of the kind of online hubs of transphobia and really like big mobilization of anti-trans groups, and some of the most prominent taking to the streets anti-trans campaigners actually kind of got radicalized on a website called Mumsnet. It's a parenting forum, and like I think it serves a function for a lot of parents, but I think it's something like 90% women, so mostly mums. But yeah, like on certain corners of that, it became like this hub, and like basically any pro-trans point was shut down. Mums of trans kids basically bullied off the website, and it basically became this. Now, is that coincidence? And what I was interested in, and it's kind of for me, like a microcosm of the general problem that you're talking about. Because in America, there's a lot of right-wing groups that use moms in the title. Moms for Liberty.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, 1 million moms. And they're like these like essentially far-right groups. Is there a link? Like, why mums now? I guess what they would say is that motherhood is a point where you're radicalized and they're like, well, we're not going to accept this like denial of biology by the trans cult or whatever they say. The reality, I think, is that actually you find quite a lot of women on parenting forums who have lost their identity, are feeling quite unsupported, often whether they have a partner or not. There's even these studies that show like men think they're doing 50% and they're not. So a lot of women who have young children are on these parenting forums and perhaps, I argue, feeling quite resentful. Resentful at maybe suppressed resentment at their own partner. Resentful at like the fact that society does this bait and switch with motherhood where like there's a lot of pressure on women to do it. And then when they do it, it's kind of like, well, get on with it. And if you're a bad mother, that's your fault. And if you fuck your kids up, that's your fault. Andrea Dworkin, the sort of radical second wave feminist, kind of said that like women often can't express their resentment against the men closest to them, so they deflect it. Right-wing women will deflect it onto people of colour or lesbians in the 70s. And I think that's a good example of like how motherhood is used. Like lots of, like motherhood was so used in Trump's recent campaign. Because it's this idea, particularly white motherhood, right? It's like we've got to protect white children from the threat, whatever the threat is at any given generation.
In this instance, the threat is specifically in various forms, the three people currently talking on this podcast.
Literally. I was about to say, when I said in every generation, I was like, but it's usually the same way. It doesn't vary that much.
It doesn't feel that abstract. So as we sit at this table, it does not feel that abstract.
Yeah, I mean, fair observation. But it's clever, right? Because anyone who's a parent, you know, the protection of young people is a sort of noble aim. And a lot of parents will have a very real fear. The fear of like children being harmed is a very natural fear, but it's also one that's easily manipulated. Yeah, and with far-right movements, you know, it has a long history of like, it's good for, you know, recruiting women and it's also good for recruiting other men. But like the idealization of a certain kind of puritanical motherhood, I mean, I'm really loath to invoke Nazi Germany. Like fascistic regimes have always known that a particular idea of the mother is quite a potent idea in that imaginary. And, you know, that's not me saying that motherhood or motherly love is always this right-wing reactionary idea. It's not. Course. But, I think it can be weaponized in that regard.
So am I right in thinking that maybe we need to move away from romantic love then?
At the end of the book, I wrote this postscript because I was about to go to the printers. And actually, whilst I was writing it, I had like a whole unrequited situation and got heartbroken again. I was like, oh yeah, this is really shit. I haven't got any better at dealing with this. And I kind of wanted to be like the postscript to the final words of the book are like, I haven't given up. Also, I knew I was going into promoting this book and I didn't want to become like the face of single people because that's really bad too. Like, don't want to box myself in there. Like, no, I think the point being, I have this very full life where I'm quite happy single and I have like amazing friends and I genuinely like have, you know, had to accept like romantic love for me hasn't worked out that well thus far. And being trans, it's a little bit trickier to find it. And I have this great life. But what I do say in the book, right, because there was the single positivity movement a few years ago. And if you notice who was leading that, it was quite a lot of like middle class women of means, because it's like, it's easy to have a nice life single when you've got enough money. Like I live alone and work alone. So like living alone and not house sharing into your 40s is quite nice, being able to live alone. But that's a luxury. And then to be able to access a social realm where I don't get lonely. I mean, it's like every time I step outside my house to do something with a friend, minus 50 quid.
Yeah, 100%.
Do you know what I mean? So yes, decenter romantic love, but it's not about saying romantic love doesn't matter. But one of the things, like there's a whole chapter in the book about friendship, is I basically say like we devalue friendship. And one of the ways I guess we do that is that stuff about having people to be able to have an affordable, livable financial life, because capitalism doesn't care about friendship. The reason being, families reproduce workers for capitalism, and there is a lot of like tribal bonds in a family that serve that. Marriage, for that same reason, romantic love serves the interests of capital. Your relationship with your colleagues does. Friendship it's kind of like, that's why historically it's been treated as like a youthful pastime, because it's like, well, this isn't the real work of love, because it doesn't serve any interest. Like, we're literally friends with people because we enjoy being friends with them. And it doesn't make any money. It doesn't serve any aim. And then we've got this very bastardized form of friendship now as a result of like techno-capitalism, which is like 1 million friends in your phone and no friends.
And no one to ask you when your house is burnt down.
Yeah.
I do have one last question for you. And, we talked about love, but we also briefly touched upon hate. And there's a lot of hate going around in society. And I think it's fair to say that there can be, thinking about politics, there can be this desire to just see your opponent suffer, really. And as long as they suffer, you've won, even if you've sort of suffering yourself, or even if it's not made a change to your own life. But at least you made a migrant cry, or at least you hurt somebody else. How do we engage with people we don't love?
By virtue of being a trans woman right now, there are people that hate me, like you described. People that hate me, that do not see me as human. There is nothing I can do to humanize myself to them. They are a minority, but unfortunately quite a growing, powerful minority. And it's depressing. And so one thing I touch on, I talk about spirituality and the rediscovery of like a spiritual life. For me, that looks like belief in God, but like the book isn't about trying to get anyone to believe in God. The reason, though, that helped me is because I realized that probably a few years ago, I was consumed with rage all the time and wishing ill on people that wished me ill, and permanently in that state of rage and kind of hatred, and realizing I was being coached into meeting that energy with that energy. And I realized like that there's a reason why it's destructive. When they say it's like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Yeah.
Or why like even Martin Luther King said that that love was easier to bear than hate. And that's how he felt about his enemies, because people often forget that he was a deeply spiritual Christian. And I think like, to me, some of that with the people that really hate me, it's like, well, they're dehumanizing me. They refuse to see my humanity. And my way of responding to that dehumanization, I've realized, is to always remember people's humanity, even people who are doing the most heinous things. Sounds really noble.
It does sound noble.
But,
yeah,
but like, even at the psychological level, that doesn't mean I'm going to be friends with them. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be, DMing with them on X or whatever. But like, people throughout human history, like oppressed groups, have had to find ways of dealing with oppression and not being consumed by rage. Yeah. And for me, it's what works. Now, there's also a category of people who I disagree with or who are not like me, but perhaps aren't full of hate. And I have been quite bad at engaging with them. And even people quite close to me on the political spectrum. I talk about the kind of wild west of the left-wing internet in the 2010s where like everyone was calling everyone out. And I mean, I was engaging in that too. And I sort of say in the book, like I have regrets about that. And in some cases, I've apologized to people directly for like the ways in which I was quite unforgiving and quite self-righteous, as many people in their 20s are. It's easy to love people that are like us.
Yeah.
And that we would pick as friends. Sometimes in progressive movements, we're very quick to tear each other down. And that's actually replicating the tactics of our enemies. So it's much harder to be loving to everyone. But I think for me, that's like the challenge of the work of being a progressive.
Shon, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK. Love in Exile is a fantastic book and it's out now. And if you're listening to the podcast, I'm holding up the cover next to my face. Now, after the break, we're going to be looking into another area affecting our mental health, social media. Should the government be getting tougher on regulating it? Now, the scroll is something we're all afflicted by in our modern age, but how much damage is it actually doing to us? Reports vary, but one thing's for sure, it's proving very difficult for governments around the world to legislate against the effects social media is having on all of our lives.
But what do you do about it? Last year, Australia introduced the world's strictest laws against social media giants, banning children under the age of 16 from using their services. Questions abound as to how this might actually work, with the law set to come into force at the end of the year.
Here in the UK, next week, Parliament will debate a petition that has received over 100,000 signatures that requests we follow suit and introduce similar restrictions for our young people. Joining us now to discuss what our government might do to make social media safer for all of us is Patricia Clark, technology reporter at Tortoise Media. Welcome to Pod Save the UK.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's be real. This petition has no real chance of becoming law, does it?
No, there was a moment when Peter Kyle...
I was sorry, it's really made me laugh that you just went, no.
So I sort of paused because there was a moment where the tech secretary sort of said, okay, we're going to try and put pressure on Ofcom, who's a tech regulator, to put pressure on the tech giants to do this. And if they don't do it, then maybe we'll consider an Australia-type ban. And then a week later, he said, actually, that's not on the cards at all.
Right.
Why did the government backtrack so quickly?
I think they're in a really difficult position right now because they are pushing this idea of growth. You know, we don't want to be like Europe, which has currently got this reputation for being stagnant and regulatory and boring. So maybe Brexit provides an opportunity for us to be able to say, actually, we're the place where innovation and growth happens. But then equally, the UK has been a country that's actually been really forward-thinking in terms of its online safety laws. So the Online Safety Bill is the first of its kind.
From your perspective as a technology reporter, do you consider that to be a useful and good piece of legislation? Because, to be honest, the rest of us, a lot of the time, don't know what the fuck is going on in these conversations.
There are parts of it that are really, really, I think, positive and exciting. For example, you know, we're going to be the first country to look at actually prosecuting people for creating deepfakes, not just distributing them. There are going to be fines levied against big tech companies. That's the first of its kind law in this space. And it could mean that other countries follow suit. And that's all really positive. But there are other things that have come under criticism. You know, one of the things that's on the table is age verification, for example. And we know that I think it's between 5 and 7 million people in the UK alone don't have IDs. So what would that actually look like? There's a lot of kind of things that could go wrong, but I think it's an interesting starting point. And I think it's equally, though, it's cornered people like Peter Kyle because they're saying on the one hand, we want growth. And on the other hand, we're this kind of bastion of regulation. And where do we find something kind of in the middle?
I think it's worth saying that the stakes couldn't really be higher, though, right? Like, I mean, it's now indisputable that there is harm that is happening through online platforms and that children are being affected.
Yeah. Ofcom has really good data on this. So, you know, they say 9 in 10 children own a mobile phone by the time they reach the age of 11. That's obviously very young. The House of Commons report found that children between the age of 13 and 17 have encountered one or more potential harms online. That can be violent content, that can be content that's pornographic. And 3 in 5 secondary school age children have been contacted online in a way that potentially made them feel uncomfortable. More than that, we have, you know, Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, leaked that Instagram had data that young women's mental health was being harmed by the kind of content that they were seeing. And it was that whistleblower that forced Meta to take some form of action against this. The problem with this is that we don't have sort of big longitudinal studies that tell us exactly how linked these harms are to social media. And I kind of think both things can be true. We can see a trend. We know that young people's mental health, anxiety, depression, and suicide rates are all going up. And we know that smartphones came into the picture 15 years ago. We can see that link. I don't see why we can't start taking protective and decisive action.
What does practical action look like in this instance? Because I have 2 cousins that are themselves Australian children. They're 18 and 20. And when I
think 20 is not a child.
Well, they're children from my perspective. Anyone under 30 is a child from my perspective at this point. So they're exiting the period that we're really talking about, this sort of the vulnerable teenage years, and they are now voting age adults. And I asked them about this bill, and I was quite surprised how in favour of it they were.
Really?
Yeah. They were very much of the opinion that they had observed harms done to them and their friends by being exposed to these things at younger ages. But the point that they then raised is so much of their social lives are now driven through these apps that there's a danger if you just suddenly remove them of actually isolating children further. If we've come to the conclusion, as we all have pretty much, that these things do harm to children, what are the actual practical measures that governments can take?
So just on the Australia ban, what's kind of interesting is that they've just done a blanket ban, and some of the critiques are, well, you know, people will find ways around that. Norway banned social media for children under 13, and there was a study that found that 72% of 11-year-olds had found a way around that,
Wow.
which I thought was amazing. But I think it's a broader cultural conversation which needs to be had in terms of practical measures. I think you need public health campaigns.
Yeah.
I'm still pro things like algorithmic transparency. I think that's something that you could push on the companies to try and see how this data is being used and how they're targeting children in that way.
To move on to a different area of online safety, last week there was a multinational AI summit in Paris where 60 countries signed a declaration of inclusive and sustainable artificial intelligence for all. 2 countries were notably missing, the US and the UK. A spokesperson for Downing Street said we weren't following the US's lead, but that this is about our own national interest, ensuring the balance between opportunity and security. Can you wade through that word soup to discern what the fuck that means?
I mean, the UK has a point in that it's slightly kumbaya. It's like, we're all going to be open and transparent and ethical. And it's got these 6 points and it's not very specific.
Yeah.
And the UK actually did say, it didn't provide enough clarity on global governance and the national security challenge that AI poses. And to that extent, they have a point. Equally, I think it does go back to what we were talking about earlier, which is this idea of growth and this feeling of they don't want to be lumped in with Europe and all of the countries that are pushing for regulation, and they want to look like they're doing innovative things.
My concern here is that Elon Musk and Google have all warned that tech companies might choose to not launch products in the UK due to the funding structure for the Online Safety Act. And there are Ofcom plans to charge tech giants fees equivalent to about 0.02% of their global revenue to enforce the laws, which would generate around 70 million quid a year. Since the first discussions about the Online Safety Act, Musk has turned a huge amount of attention and hostile attention to the United Kingdom. Now, am I being what I usually am, which is a profoundly paranoid man here, to say that Musk's threats and saber rattling from those tech companies is something that maybe is colouring our government's actions in this area? And is that why potentially they might not be willing to sign up to the AI thing? A separate issue from it being a bit kumbaya, which is a wonderful turn of phrase.
I think some of the figures there have been a little bit misreported. So they want to raise about £70 million from the big tech companies. They're saying this is 0.02% of global revenue. It's about £10 million each, which if you think of a company like Apple, that's
some change.
That's like 1p for most of us.
Yeah.
And so they've put out these statements where they've said, Google said it could disincentivize people. Uber said that as well. X said that as well. But they weren't very strongly worded.
Yeah,
and realistically, the amount of money that they're going to make from staying in Britain is going to be much bigger than 10 million. And so I'd be surprised if they left. Equally, I think you do have a point that, Elon Musk has obviously spoken out against the UK. Ofcom, interestingly, the regulator said that there was a clear link between what happened on X and the discourse on X and the actual violence on the street. And I think the implication was, although they didn't say it, we could fine for something like that. The maximum fine there, again, is 18 million, which for Twitter isn't a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
The optics would be so bad to say that as soon as a country tries a little bit of regulation, we're just pulling out of it entirely. That would look, for Google, TikTok, the US, it would look so bad that I don't think that they would do that.
Thin skin is very in fashion with their current leadership.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Pod Save the UK, Patricia Clark. And listeners, do check out her work on Tortoise's Slow Newscast. In the latest episode, you actually talk about how Silicon Valley billionaires are trying to live forever, which aligns with one of my personal obsessions, Brian Johnson.
He's in it.
I think this one of the strangest men to ever live.
Is he the guy who put a chip in his head, or is he injecting his son's blood?
Son's blood.
I forgot.
Son's blood.
Right.
Son's blood.
Son's blood. We should say for legal clarification, he doesn't do that anymore. It's fucking weird.
And that's it. Thanks for listening to Pod Save the UK. Don't forget to follow at Pod Save the UK on Instagram, TikTok and Twitter. And we're on Blue Sky now too. Follow us at podsavetheuk.crooked.com. And if you want more of us, make sure you've subscribed to our YouTube channel. We'll have exclusive cuts on there, extended interviews, and you get to see Nish's face in full colour.
Terrifying full colour.
Angry and disgusted, full colour.
Angry, disgusted, dishevelled. The Nish Kumar story.
Pod Save the UK is a reduced listening production for Crooked Media.
Thanks to senior producer James Tyndale and assistant producer May Robson, with additional research from Isabella Anderson.
Our theme music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos.
Thanks to our engineer Jeet Vasani.
The executive producers are Anushka Sharma, Tanya Hines, Madeline Herringer, and Katie Long, with additional support from Irish Sports.
And remember to hit subscribe for new shows on Thursdays on Amazon, Spotify, or Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.